All right, so we're going to talk about gender. Specifically in this video, we're going to talk about what sociologists mean when we talk about gender as socially constructed, as socially produced, something that we create and enact. And what sociologists exactly mean by that, how that kind of works. So I want to start with this image. This is a famous American, someone whose name you're going to recognize and know. But I want you to take a look at this photo. This is a photo of them when they were around 2.5 years old. Who do you think this is? Let's take a little stab at this and just take a moment. I'll give you a few minutes maybe to think about this. Who do you think this is an image of? Why don't you go ahead and write it down? Think for a moment. Who is this a picture of? It's a famous American, someone whose name you will recognize. Who do you think it is? All right, take a few more seconds to see if you can figure this out. Go ahead and write it down. Okay, well, I'll tell you who it is. If you guessed that this was Hillary Clinton, you would be wrong. If you guessed, though, that it is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, president during the 1930s through the Great Depression, then you would be right. This is actually Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he was 2.5 years old in 1884. Now, you probably saw this image and thought this must be a girl. The famous person that we're talking about must be a woman, but it's not. It turns out to be a boy. And in this case, what you see here that led you to believe it was probably a girl. You probably saw the long hair, this nice frilly hat. If you look down here, you can see these shoes. These are sort of nice. Perhaps we think of these as girl shoes. He's in a dress, but this was actually very common in the late 1800s. It was quite conventional for boys to wear dresses until they were around age 6 or 7. It was considered a gender-neutral attire. And so I use this image right now for you to sort of think about and prime you to see that there are all kinds of cues around us that we use to mark off people in a particular gender, to mark off people as boys or girls, as men or women. So let's think a little bit more deeply about that. Sociologists make an important distinction in thinking about the social construction of gender, and that is the distinction of sex and gender. When we think about sex and gender, we tend to conflate these things, and we often tend to think, well, there are obvious biological, hormonal differences between men and women that make them who they are. But this sort of misses the importance of the distinction between sex and gender. When we talk about sex, we're talking about our kind of biology, and specifically our reproductive organs. So we're talking about male and female reproductive parts, reproductive organs. And we have this idea in our society, especially, that there are two and only two sexes. Now, I want to point out to you that the idea that there are two and only two sexes actually varies across societies and over time. But we're going to use the term sex to denote this distinction around reproductive organs. Gender, though, is something very different. When we talk about gender, what we're really talking about is a cultural script. We're talking about a set of expectations for how it is that we expect or think boys and girls, men and women should behave. And so we layer on top of this sex distinction a cultural script that is then going to define how you're able to act, what we're supposed to do, what kinds of activities we can engage in, what kinds of emotions that we can express, how we are supposed to relate to our same and gender sexed partners. Right? Now, the idea of gender as a social construction, or the way that we can most readily see that gender is a social construction, is that that particular cultural script, those expectations, those for behavior, expectations for expression of emotion, expectations for what you can and can't do, how we're going to think and feel. These things actually vary over time and across societies. These expectations we have vary over time and from place to place. And so it's through seeing this variation that we can come to understand. This becomes empirical information that tells us that gender is in fact something that is socially produced. It's not written into the laws of nature. It's something that varies, that we can see changing, and therefore we know is being socially produced in some way. So let's take a look at how this might work. You can see these images here are of cheerleaders, and what's particularly notable about these cheerleaders is that all of these images are of female cheerleaders, of women and girls who are cheerleading. All right, and this is quite common. If you go to any sporting event, this is what you will see. Local high school football teams, you will see girls who are engaged in the act of cheerleading. But this was not actually always the case. If you go backwards in time, here are some images from around the 1920s, 1930s of cheerleaders. And this was the common images that you would see at a football game, at a pep rally, boys and men who were engaged in cheerleading. In fact, one of our most famous presidents, George W. Bush, was a cheerleader at Yale University when he was there. And so it's really actually not until after the 1930s that women begin to take over this activity. So up until the 1930s, cheerleading was a male activity. It was something that was an expected activity of boys and of young men to engage in. Let's take a look at some of these images as well. Here are some photographs of men from probably around the early 1900s, late 1800s. And here what we can see is a level of affection that you generally will not see today between men or between boys. Right? We've got over here two men embracing each other. In this photograph, a man sitting on top of another man's lap, embracing their arms interlinked here. They're holding hands. Arms on top of sort of leaning onto each other in this image. And these images strike us as interesting because this is not the way that men typically are expected to express themselves and their affection, if they have any, towards one another. In fact, the way men are supposed to express emotions and affection like this is at a kind of social distance. And in fact, if you go to other countries, you will find men engaging in expressing emotions in this way as well. So we can go from place to place and see that how it is the expectations, the scripts for men and for women can in fact and do vary both over time and from place to place. So what I want you to see out of this is that gender is a social construction. It's not something we're used to sort of thinking about it as written into the laws of nature. But gender is not something written into nature. It is culturally created. It is a script, and that script can change over time and from place to place. Now, this doesn't mean we should not think of gender as real. It is real, but it is only real in a social sense. It is real in terms of how we construct it and how that social construction affects how we act, what we can do, how we think about others, how we think about ourselves, how we experience emotions and express emotions. All of that is sort of bound up with the way that we construct those expectations for men and women. Okay, so gender is socially constructed, socially produced. Let's give that some thought and we'll move forward.